documentary screening. So now we'll move on to our panel discussion, and we're introducing Kun Paul, Kun Vatarod, and Kun Suripon to the stage to talk about their experience with Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. Um, Here, our moderator, Kun Win, runs the business development at OmisGo, which is an Ethereum-based financial network that facilitates a real-time peer-to-peer value exchange of crypto assets. He is a Sasin alumni, and before that, he studied business strategy at the University of New South Wales. And Kun Bir, he is the CEO of Silk Crypto, a top-notch ICO advisory for both public and private sector in all major markets, including the US, Europe, and Asia. And prior to this, he was a managing director at Black Horse, as well as KPMG and Deloitte. He earned his LLM in financial services from the University of New South Wales and his Bachelor of Law from Thammasat. And finally, Kun Paul Ark, is the managing director of corporate venture capital at Digital Ventures, where he manages 100 million in fintech venture capital funding. He also volunteers at Startup Grind Seed Stars, and he earned his MBA from Northwestern and his BS in business administration from UC Berkeley. So thank you so much for coming, and we'll pass it off to Kun Win to moderate today. And this in case we have kept questions later.
All right. Thank you for inviting me over. It's always good to come back. I think maybe before we actually drive down into the whole discussion, just a general, so we understand, like in terms of the audience a little bit, like so, who are like from the tech sector? Anyone from the tech sector and running your own, looking to, you know, build a startup based on blockchain technology? Anybody? No. No, so business, pure business guy, right? Okay, who own Bitcoin, altcoin, or whatever as an investment class? Okay, all right, all right, cool. So, I think where we should start with maybe a little bit in terms of, furthermore in terms of the introduction, right? So I'll start first. Um, my name is Win. I'm doing a business development for a company based here in Thailand called Omise Go. So Omise Go is a blockchain company that is building on Ethereum. And I guess the second question that I always find it fun to discuss is how I get into the the actual blockchain thing, the business, right? So I start off as after I finished my MBAs in Sasin, went to work for the bank because bank sucks. So I want to disrupt banks, but I then we did some kind of a startup, and then at the end didn't go through, didn't get any kind of funding. So the bank called me up and say, you know, the other day when you're pitching, how's that project going on? I say, no, I actually get, you know, screwed an investor and didn't go over. So went to work for a bank a couple of years, and then moved into a fintech with DTech e-wallets, and then move over to Omise, and that's where the wallets and I start to learn a little bit more about the blockchain. So that's how my journey is at right now. So maybe PPA want to share a little bit.
So actually, I'm like study about blockchain because I like interest in the blockchain. Like in like 2016, I found that Bitcoin is the best perform asset. So I wonder why Bitcoin become like the best perform asset. So I studied like what is it, and I found that it is a technology that can like disrupt everything. So I start invest in the Bitcoin, and then I have like in 2017, I got a call from one of my friends in Switzerland, and he asked me about the regulation, about the security, something like that, and also like about the security law, and he told me like uh, he need my advice about like about the ICO project. So I have a chance to get into the ICO market. That's from my side.
Um, I'm not actually at the core either a technologist or a blockchain person. I started my career as an investment banker, doing tech and telecom. So it's more, I was, I spent a lot of time working on technology investment through the dot com boom, and also rode the dot com bust all the way to zero. So I made my money during the dot com boom, and I lost my money during the dot com bust. And I'd actually, so I came from a varied career from investment banking in Silicon Valley and most parts of Asia, to retail. Actually, I spent 10 years as a retailer. I was opening up a bunch of retail stores in Asia, first with Central Group, and then with Apple, and then with Microsoft. So I spent a great deal of my time doing real estate deals, particularly in China. But while I was there, I sort of got pulled into the tech space. So I wound up doing a bit of angel investing across a variety of sectors as an angel. Mentored a lot of startups. And so when I moved to Thailand in 2015, or I should say moved back to Thailand in 15, I was really just running around this ecosystem, uh, mentoring startups, investing in startups uh, on my own account. And about 2 years ago, I was asked by Siam Commercial Bank to run their new fintech venture capital fund with the objective of identifying technologies that would either enhance the bank or disrupt it. So my job is to do one of the either. If the bank's enthusiastic about the technology, great. And if they're not, then I'm going to try and find a way to disrupt it. Um, but at the end of the day, it was just a platform to see how we could uh, really just bring new technologies into Thailand that, well, for the good of the country. But if it helps the bank, great. But at the end of the day, I'm not a commercial banker by trade. I'm a technology investor, and so my perspective is as one from the outside. Now that does include some of the technologies we do look at do include blockchain related technologies. The first direct investment I made once I managed the fund was in Ripple a couple years ago. Not the cryptocurrency, but the company itself. So we invested in Ripple. We were the first bank in Thailand to engage with blockchain technology. Even though we announced that we were using Ripple in 2017, we're actually using the technology as early as 2016. Uh, we are blockchain agnostic, so we are in the process of exploring other blockchain technologies. R3, digital asset holdings. We're looking across the board. So we are quite interested in blockchain, but at the end of the day, we're really looking for solutions to solve problems.
So I actually list a little bit of questions. I know that people get asked a lot. The last time we were there is exactly the same question, but I guess we're coming from a two direction, right? A VC, a traditional like a VC, and then an ICO kind of like in another direction. So I guess my question is, what's your view on, let's say, if today there's a aspiring entrepreneur and want to do a startup in terms of like source of fund that they're going to do, what's the different models, what are your comment on a VC model against, let's say, an ICO models? Maybe coming from the VC first and then maybe the ICO guys.
Yeah, I mean, it's, these type of questions are always a little tricky because I wear multiple hats. Again, I'm paid to be a VC, and when I'm not a VC, I actually mentor and invest in startups myself. And sometimes, I want to, fight the man, and the other times I work for the man. Um, and that said, I am a venture capitalist, but I actually have participated as an investor in an ICO. In the interest of full disclosure, it is Omise Go at the invitation of Jun. Um, and a lot of it is I'm not, you know, I am fascinated with the technology behind blockchain and the technology that powered Bitcoin. But at the same time, I'm a bit of a pragmatist, so I won't blindly evangelize about Bitcoin. I think if you've read the white paper, it is a fascinating white paper. It's not that long. It's not incredibly technical, but I think the ideas behind it are quite powerful. But at the same time, I'm one of these raging evangelists that feel like we need to bring down regulators and the state and banks. For me, at the end of the day, I invest in technology because we look to solve problems, and so I don't invest in technology for the sake of technology. I invest in technology to solve problems. So as a venture capitalist, that's what we're really looking for. Now, without trying to ramble too much, the question is, uh, you know, when startups are looking to raise funds, they're trying to solve a problem. They're trying to raise capital, uh, and so they could raise capital in any number of forms. The easiest form is self finance. It's readily available. It doesn't take a lot of time. It's relatively cheap. You don't dilute. The next level is to go to friends and family. The next level is to start looking for outside funding, and it's a question of, do you go to venture capital? Do you go to ICO? If really what you need is the money without the advice, the connections, all of that process, not so much worried about how you might get regulated down the line, um, yeah, ICOs seem to be quite easy. Whether the momentum behind it will continue, anyone's guess. The amount of ICO money that's been raised this year is quite staggering. I believe the number is about $9.8 billion just in the first 5 months of this year, which is about 50% higher than all of last year. So it doesn't look like it's slowing down anytime soon. But as a venture capitalist, I do get a lot of companies that approach me because they're looking for more than just the money. If you want anonymous money, you could equity crowdfund, you can raise an ICO. But we do get companies that want a connection to the bank. They want access to, you know, the bank's network, my network. They're looking for mentorship and advisory. And so I think at the end of the day, they look for one form of financing or the other because they're trying to solve their specific problems, which might either just be cheap capital or capital plus value added services.
And hello. For my side, I think the beautiful of ICO is you don't have to give up your equity. You don't have to give up your control. And the last one is the number when you compare between the money raised from the ICO and the money raised from the VC. For the ICO, it can be higher. That the beautiful of the ICO. And also about the time that you have to spend on the fundraising. On the VC, you have to like talk to the VC and have prepare everything like proper document for their due diligence. But for the ICO, it's not. You can like have an idea, write to the white paper, and have a proper like legal structure, and then have a like very good marketing on fundraising. Then you can go for the public, and that's the thing that different between the ICO and the venture cap.
So then I guess my follow-up questions to maybe to PPR is like, okay, what do you, I mean, to raise a project, right, regardless of like the VC or through like ICO, you still based on the problem, right? If it has to be the right problems.
Yep.
And then I mean, in terms of like what we would say to, let's say, a far right people who say that ICOs is, there's no, I would say, it's a system of check, because you can just write a paper and then nobody is validating and stuff. But in the VC models, obviously there's a lot, a bit more, because there's things about smart money, connection, and things like that. But through ICO is like it's almost racing through 5 pieces of paper which anyone can write. What would you say to like extreme people like that?
Actually, it's depend on the like the idea in the project, because actually now is the process will be like, okay, you have you have a idea for the ICO, and then you go to talk with the institutional investor to invest in and to pitch with them to invest in your project, but not in the form of the equity, but the coin. And the coin is like, is totally different from the equity, because actually it's like you are like sell your sell with, like, in the future, like you sell the product at the time that you have no product, but you will have the product in the future for them to use, and they can use coin to like pay for your service in the future. That's the form of the ICO.
So I guess when we are talking about in terms of like ICOs and VC models, the inevitable questions that usually drive through is regulation, right? As we know that Bitcoin is being heavily regulated, altcoins and ICO portals and things like that. So I guess my questions to the panelists is, what is your view on, or do you see any particular um, that they're two almost an extreme end, right? Like China, who I totally know, and then there's a little bit more open where Singapore or Hong Kong that still allows all this. Um, where do you think Thailand stand, and what are the pro and con? You think which model should follow and things like? What are your comments about those questions?
Actually, we just have like the new regulation came out last month on 13, and I would say that it's like, it's a good framework that we have like something to control the market, because like for the ICO, I think the good thing is, like I said, you can raise the money like easily when compared to the IPO or VC. But the bad side of the ICO is always scam within. So when we have a law, so at least we can like eliminate like the people who have like a bad intention from the market. But because it's like the first draft, so okay, it's good that we have a framework, but it's also have a problem on the people who like run the exchange or run the blockchain or crypto business in Thailand. The same, because it's always like when you have more security, so like the freedom to run the business is lower, and when you like have a free market, everything is very fast, but you have less security. So you have, it's like the thing that you have to balance between the security and like the speed, something like that. But on the new regulation that just came out, I would say that it's a good start for the blockchain or for the crypto business in Thailand.
I think the discussion behind ICOs and cryptocurrencies is quite interesting, and I've been following the momentum over the last couple of years. The thing is, at the end of the day, ICOs are a form of raising money. It's reallocating capital. And if you can find a way to do that more efficiently and more cheaply, that's great. But the rise of ICOs doesn't necessarily equate to the rise of innovation. So, when people ask me about ICOs versus blockchain in general, those are two very different things. ICOs are issuing, it's a way of issuing capital. Blockchain is the technology in which that runs on. And so when people ask me as a banker and as a venture capitalist, particularly as a venture capitalist, what I think about ICOs, despite the volume of ICOs doesn't equate to innovation. It's what you do with the capital at the end of the day that equates to innovation. So whether it's venture capital money or ICO money, is that being invested in an app that's helping you identify where taco trucks are? Or is it going into capital that is creating the next, AI revolution? So, again, I don't, when I talk to people, I want them to focus on not just on the mechanism of raising money. Because that's what ICOs are. You can raise money through bank loans, you can raise money through debt, you can raise money through an IPO, you can raise money through venture capital, you can raise money through ICOs. But at the end of the day, what is that money being used for? Now, again, whether or not ICOs will maintain the momentum, whether they result in viable projects, whether they result in scams, that is an issue about accountability, regulations, whatnot. I think probably where the conversation ought to go is what is the future of blockchain, and what are the use cases of blockchain, and what can you do with blockchain? Because whether you fund blockchain through ICOs or whether you fund blockchain through regular VC money, um, what blockchain will do. That is the real power behind what Satoshi Nakamoto had unleashed. Even Bitcoin itself. I'm fairly neutral about Bitcoin itself, but I'm quite bullish on the revolution that was on the technology that it unleashed, which is what blockchain can do. I actually think cryptocurrency will ultimately mature into an incredibly valuable, whether it's a cryptocurrency or whether it's some sort of store of information or value. I think it will evolve, and I think it will provide value. But again, I think just ICOs themselves, in and of themselves, uh, I don't think that's the end game.
Yeah, I definitely with people on that. Actually, I think the next part of the question is I want to bring the conversation a little bit back to the technology that power Bitcoin, right? The actual blockchain. So I have a question here is maybe to both of the panelists is what are like to you what are the interesting blockchain use case that you've seen? I'm sure that there are a lot of projects actually coming through, or you know, as a people as a VC, I'm sure there's a lot of stuff who will come and pitch you a little bit of stuff. And which industry you think will pick up first, and why, and what is the I would say the implication of, let's say, blockchain to Thailand, right? I know that in the region, Vietnam is making a way in terms of blockchain. They have like labs and they have a lot of good developers out there in Vietnam. Singapore is making a lead way as well. So, what are your comment on the use cases, the implication, and things like that?
Um, so I think there's obviously, fintech has, financial services has led the way. Um, but that's simply because blockchain was a technology that was powering a currency. But I don't think it is a financial technology in and of itself. Uh, the the power of blockchain is really to move information uh, between different sources without the need for an intermediary. That was the original premise behind blockchain, Bitcoin itself. So, any industry that requires complex processes and intermediaries to facilitate trust um, is, I think, is vulnerable to distributed ledger technology. So obviously, banking is one, because you're creating banks as an intermediary in the middle. Uh, but I think any process that revolves around complex steps and intermediaries, and that could be healthcare, that could be in education, that could be in trade finance. There are very few industries that don't have levels of inefficiency and intermediaries that can't be disrupted by blockchain. I think the promise of blockchain in Thailand is phenomenal because, if anything, this is a country that is rife with processes, steps, intermediaries, and inefficiencies. So when I come to this country and I see how incredibly inefficient it is, I see nothing but promise for blockchain technology. So again, I think the banks were first up to bat. Siam Commercial Bank, started using, Ripple in 2016. K Bank and Krung Si and Bangkok Bank followed with either blockchains operating off of Hyperledger or R3. But you're starting to see industrial companies look at this. Looking at governments, government agencies looking at blockchain for a variety of different things. So, again, I'm generally bullish about blockchain as a whole. I'll have very specific opinions about individual startups based on their teams and the technology, but I may not evangelize about crypto, and I may not evangelize about Bitcoin, but I will evangelize about the underlying technology that pins it all.
And for myself, I'm quite agree with Kun Paul that the first the first sector that should adopt the blockchain should be like financial service. But actually, the thing that I would like to see in Thailand is government sector to use blockchain because like it sure that it increase transparent, but I'm not sure that they will happy to use the blockchain in
No, no, no. They are. I mean, you know, the the Bank of Thailand has mandated that a coalition of the largest banks in Thailand start looking at blockchain technologies for trade finance, and they've already started initiating letters of guarantee products on that. Um, Part of the Thailand 4.0 initiative is creating a scheme around digital identity, which would basically streamline any sort of record keeping around your identity. Obviously, one of the easiest places to extract value from that is from the distribution of government services. So, you know, the Thai government is very, very keen on blockchain technology. Now, it's still government, which means that no, 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 I mean, we laugh, but we sit there and say it's very easy to sit there and say governments stifle innovation. But the thing to remember about governments is that their sole, they have they have to wear multiple hats. As corporates and as technologists and as VCs, we can focus on profit and innovation, but the government also they need to foster that, and they have to look after the public good. So they have to wear multiple hats. And that said, I have to say, I mean, I've been dealing with the Bank of Thailand, I've been dealing with government officials for the 2, 3 years since I've been back. They are moving forward cautiously, but quite progressively. And I think to the point, um, you know, Thailand is probably the first country, first economy, first regime to issue clear regulations on ICOs. Now that's still going to evolve. It's going to be imperfect, but I think they're acting like a startup. You're gonna release an MVP and you're gonna evolve it as you go. And so again, it's not perfect. The Thai government's not perfect, uh, but when it comes to at least the enthusiasm and the effort, I give them an A for effort. Whether it's an A for achievement, we'll see. Uh, but there's certainly a lot more forward thinking than, again, we're saying, how do they compare against China? How do they compare against Japan? How do they compare against Singapore or London or the US? I would say, they may not be a trailblazer, but they're certainly looking to kind of lead the way in some places.
I mean, I do agree with people. Although it's like Thai government is still Thai government, but A plus for the initiative. Like at the NDID, they've been talking about, if anyone have heard Project Internon, which is like tokenized fiat. They start to look at that, and we are the first few countries that actually did some kind of regulation. I mean, it's not going to be perfect from day one, right? I mean, even us as a technologist, we're still learning it every day, and we are at forefront. We are coding it, and so for regulars, I'll say that that they're doing quite a lot already, and we get even as like Omise ago, we also get called a lot to actually go in and then explain to them stuff, and that's a good thing because you know I think the I think what we need right now is the blockchain technology. The knowledge chain is very long, right? So you're talking about from the beginning, you have people like Satoshi white paper, or you have Vitalik or Ethereum Foundation, or people at Stellar, or people at Ripple, what look doing like complex blockchain stuff, and then you have people who are building something on top, and you have people who are actually using these tools, and then you have the B2B business that using. So the whole thing is really long to translate all the way from the Vitalik guy all the way to the end consumer is like a long way to go.
But I mean, in the grand scheme of things, if you think about it, I mean, I know ICOs have they've entered the public consciousness in the last couple of maybe the last year and a half, 18 months. Um, ICOs actually have been around since about 2013, when Mastercoin did their ICO. But I would say it was largely on its flat curve until probably late 16, and then 17 it just exploded. ICO started to explode probably second quarter of 17, and then all the crypto made, they just went on this humongous bull run at the end of 17. Um, so I think if you went back to say 2016 and you ask anyone in the blockchain community about ICOs, there probably would have been very little conception of what they were. If you asked the government what ICOs were, they would have no idea what you're talking about. They're just trying to figure out what blockchain was. So to go from say 2017 to 2018, they've issued regulations on ICOs in a year. Now try doing anything if you work in a corporate for a year. Just to penetrate most corporates as a startup, it probably is a 1 year, 2 year sales cycle. So the Thai regulators came up with regulations on ICOs in a year. Many people may not be aware, but the Stock Exchange of Thailand just launched an equity crowdfunding platform for startups to raise funds, and it just went live. It's called SET Live. They launched it maybe 2 months ago. It is powered by blockchain. If you asked me 2 years ago that the Stock Exchange of Thailand would be doing a blockchain-powered equity crowdfunding platform, I would have said it's crazy. It's Thailand. These guys aren't that progressive. But they did. Is it perfect? By no means. It's going to flounder for a while before it takes off. But the fact that they're willing to just get it out there and do it, get something out there and iterate. That's the very essence of what startups are trying to do. MVP, build, test, measure, learn.
On what?
No, I always find the discussions very interesting. I mean, like the blockchain use case is a bit more interesting than the ICOs part. But I guess what we will do is we'll open up for Q&A, and I already finished up all my prepared questions, so I guess I'll throw it up to you guys. Yeah.
Okay, wow, that's a lot to absorb. Okay, I'm trying to think back to. Okay, well, why don't we start there before you go into the. So I mean, I think it's still a process. I would probably say the I would say in Thailand, I think a lot of the corporates, particularly the ones that are starting to engage with technology, have a much better awareness of blockchain and crypto than they did 2 years ago. I would probably say 2016 was the year that everyone was talking about blockchain but had no idea what it was. They just kept hearing about it, and so it was just like, what is blockchain? What is blockchain? What is blockchain? And there were, any number of conferences, and then Don Tapscott came out with his book, and there's like a bunch of courses on Coursera and Udemy and all these other things. I think 17 was the year that, even though people were still talking about it, uh, the talk died down. Not because there was any lack of enthusiasm, but that was because that's when the companies and I think the agencies started to say, okay, let's take this behind the curtain and let's start testing out the technology. Let's work with IBM. Let's work with R3. Let's work with Ripple. Let's develop our own blockchains. And then I think this year is the year that we're starting to see some of those results, and we're trying to say, okay, let's get at least for the early starters in the corporate world, they're moving out of the sandboxes, they're moving out of the proofs of concept, and they're trying to find the ways to implement the technology. So, um, you're still trying to push awareness of blockchain down to say the mass level. So, in a way, we're kind of in that early AOL moment where you're trying to convince uh, technology neophytes that this is what email is, and you're going to get your CD in the mail, and you're going to load AOL onto your computer, and you're just going to figure out what all this is. I think we're still in that phase. But I mean, I think probably the biggest issue with blockchain, and I got this question a lot in the early days, is I just kept getting questions from people in the bank on how does it work, and they sit there and it's like, do you really want to know about, like, do you have a background in cryptography? Because I don't. And do you really want to know this? And they're like, I don't understand hashing. I don't understand. I'm like, you use email every day. Do you know STML? Do you know TCP/IP? Can you explain that to me? Can you tell me how photons of light go through fiber optic cable? You don't. So why do you use email? And it's all about, at the end of the day, it's the utility. What problem are you trying to solve? So when I was going to the bank, and I'm saying I want to invest in Ripple, and they're like, well, explain to us how it works. And I'm like, you don't need to know how it works. You just need to know that it's quicker, faster, cheaper. And if that doesn't appeal to you, that's fine. I can find something that's more expensive, more inefficient, but so it was just, I think that's the big challenge of some of these technologies, is that you get bankers that want to know exactly how the technology works. And I guarantee there's not a single banker in my bank at the senior management level that has a background in cryptography. So even if I explained hashing, like I sat in front of my chairman and I had to explain this whole concept of people mining. And he's sitting there and he's asking questions, and it sounds really dumb. When I hear myself speaking to him, and it's like, he's like, why will people do it for free? No, they don't do it for free. They solve puzzles. They solve mathematical puzzles for these coins. And he said, well, who issues these coins? And I'm like, well, they just kind of come out of the algorithm. And I'm like, well, who designed the algorithm? And I said, well, this guy, Satoshi Nakamoto. And he's like, well, who's Satoshi Nakamoto? And I'm like, no one knows.
No one
And when I'm listening to myself, I'm like, my chairman is looking at me like I'm fucking high. He's like, you're talking about magic fairy coins from the Santa Claus figure that doesn't exist. And it literally sounds like Santa Claus. Like, if you're really good, this imaginary fat man will come down your chimney and give you toys. And that would not be any more crazy than me trying to explain Satoshi Nakamoto, this code that magically limits the number of bitcoins to 21 million. and you just have to solve puzzles to win some. I'm like, okay, fine. You don't need to know this. You just need to know that it works,
Yeah.
and this is the concept behind it, and this is what it does. So this is a weird, it's a weird technology.
Yeah.
But I think part of the education that we're getting around is, shifting the focus away from how the technology works to what the technology does, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't stop trying to validate and poke holes in the technology. But it's again, I'm operating in fields where I have to explain quantum physics. I do a lot of deep tech investments, so I'm accounting guy. I studied accounting and finance. Now I got to learn cryptography. I got to understand quantum physics.
Yep.
It's a mad, mad world.
Yeah. I think people is definitely right. Like,
Sorry, that was a long rant, but
no.
once you get me going, it's
No,
just
it's like
ah.
I definitely feel you. Like, because of what my role is, and when I started this, like, the first thing, when I go and meet potential client or potential user, I usually start off with, like, how blockchain work and what so on and so forth. It becomes very complex. And then after that, after like 2 months, I realized that nobody wants to know internet. People want to know Google, Facebook. So it dive down to that. The next big company is the one who can humanize this whole process and come up with like that use case. I think definitely, yeah, just solve the problem. Is the technology is really complex. Like, that's why I say the journey from the brain of Ethereum guys, the Ethereum Foundation guys, to the use cases is really really long. So someone who figured out the use case to humanize it, maybe put some design thinking into it, and draw out it to some kind of a final product, that will be the next, I say, with the Google or the Facebook in the blockchain era. Yeah. Right, PBL. I'm sure you have something.
I would like to add a little bit about the regulation in Thailand. And your question is, like, what is the situation of the Thai when we compare to the other country in Southeast Asian? I would say that I would say that now in the Southeast Asian, Thailand is the most advanced on the regulation on blockchain and cryptocurrency, because now we govern everything, like exchange, broker, dealer, and also the ICO, everything. We have a rule to govern everything.
I think what's also interesting is we talk about how China banned ICOs and the other nations are looking at it. Don't believe for a second that China is not going to go in full steam ahead. China has a habit of saying, okay, until we fully understand what's going on and we understand how we can at least establish a modicum of control over what's going on so it doesn't get ahead of us. They're going to sit there and say, we're going to shut this down, but don't believe for a second that you have a zillion super smart technocrats in China basically looking at this issue and say, how can we create a scheme that doesn't create kind of this wild, wild east of crazy folks running around speculating like mad. And I think once they figure out what they're doing, then they're basically going to lift the veil and say, okay, we've changed our mind. Here it is, and they've got a ready-made scheme going. And again, if you look at everything that China's done, China is it is a tech market on steroids. If you look at it, this is a country that spawned Alibaba, Tencent, some of the scariest tech companies in the world in terms of, as a bank, I am scared to death of these guys. And to be honest, Google and Facebook and Apple should be scared of them too, because these are smart companies with incredibly long-term strategies that operated behind this curtain of protection that the Chinese government afforded them until they were in a point where they can actually just start getting outside and dominating the world. And I think that's going to happen in the crypto space too. They're going to shut things down. They're going to figure out how to set themselves up for success, and then they're going to lift the curtain. And I think to a lot of extent, I imagine the regulators in the U.S., in Singapore, they realize this wave is coming. This technology cannot be stopped, but you need to have the break walls in place to stop, the tidal waves. and then you figure out how to set up your infrastructure, and then you kind of lift it. So I don't. I think all these bans. I don't think it's a permanent ban.
Actually, the thing that Kun Paul said is already happened because actually China is banned only for the ICO, but they're really bullish on the blockchain. And I think last 2 week, president of the
Jack Ma, right?
Xi Jinping,
Xi Jinping.
yeah, he told that he would like to have like a biggest blockchain lab in China.
Yeah, China is definitely a lot of good programmers are coming out in China as well, and China being such a big market by itself, it's really
It's like a
scary.
self,
Yeah, it's like a
self-sustained,
self-contained
yeah.
economy,
And now the biggest, the the first and the second like biggest exchange is belong to
yeah,
Chinese,
China. Yeah, and
bigger
if,
than U.S. market.
yeah. And if I'm not wrong, the last year, if you look into the patent that is being filed, in terms of the sheer number, China actually have the most like blockchain patent file. So they are really working hard on that. Yeah. Any more questions? Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I'm Chinese. I know what's going on in China. And I know a lot of things, like a lot of people, even though China been banned, a lot of companies still try to the location in Thailand.
Yes, do
Yeah.
underground,
Exactly.
not public,
So,
like a secret event, something like that.
yeah.
Raise like 20 million something.
Yeah, you know the problem. So another thing is like you actually China already applied the blockchain technology in agriculture. Have you heard about one company? They already announced the product. It's a rice, but they try to figure out the and it's like they have the tracking process to use blockchain technology. Beyond that, they know how the rice coming from to the end user. So I think that is very successful cases to use blockchain because personally, I'm more fans in the blockchain technology, not cryptocurrency. So I'm looking. I think another friend I was talking about, they have the hotel group, so they try to use the cryptocurrency in terms of transaction between some
Within the group.
yeah, the groups. So I think that could be the trend. So I really want to know like what Thailand is heading to according to the regulation on the hand at this moment. And um, as you said about China, so I want to know more about from your perspective about China. How I know the regulations, but I just want to know like technology side. Thank you.
Well, so again, there's no there's the government is not trying to regulate blockchain technology in and of itself. They're looking at industries when tech, if it touches finance, if it touches healthcare, if it touches privacy, if it touches identity, they will regulate any technology that might have an inverse impact on that. But they're not going to. If you want to use a blockchain for trade finance, if it doesn't impact the financial well-being or the financial system, if it doesn't impact people's health adversely, it's just another technology. And I think Thailand does recognize the use cases around that. You mentioned food and agriculture. There's a lot of there's companies looking at that. Food security is a very big thing. China especially. There's a lot of concern about where food is coming from and the quality of food, and you're seeing that globally. Walmart is collaborating with I think IBM and Nestle and a coalition of some of the largest food manufacturers in the world to be able to trace the origins of food. They want to go literally from farm, not even farm, field to table, to ensure that one, to ensure that for safety. If you have an E. coli outbreak in the U.S., it generally takes several days to identify the source of the contaminated food. Under blockchain, you could probably do it within a couple of hours or even minutes. And so, and again, that comes down to any sort of industry that requires this process, and that requires that requires multiple steps is either vulnerable to blockchain or is potentially enhanced by blockchain. So, food follows a certain supply chain, trade follows a certain supply chain, even real estate follows a certain supply chain. You're basically moving title deed to title deed to title deed. That's actually a big issue in China as well. Ownership over certain land titles that might have changed multiple times, and land that might have been sold or resold or doubly sold is an issue. So land, provenance, luxury items. So being able to track, diamonds. Did these diamonds come from, are they blood diamonds? Did they come from legitimate sources? So again, anything that involves a chain of custody is subject to blockchain. And so I think food is one of them. And I think Thailand recognizes that there are a lot of areas where it could be applied. That's why I think the Thai government has really led the charge, starting with banks, but also looking at trade, but almost anything that involves just complex processes. So I think the State Railway Authority of Thailand is looking at blockchain and IoT to see they can manage if they can manage listed logistics behind train arrivals and departures. So they're looking at that process. The Thai Post is looking at managing postal services on blockchain. So there are a number of different industries that it apply to, and I think Thailand is you don't hear enough about it, but it has permeated down to the industry level, not just financial services, but across a wide variety of industries.
Actually, the big conglomerate like ThaiBev, like SCG and PTT also like start looking at the blockchain and how they can integrate the blockchain and benefit to their corporate.
Mm. I think something that's important for us to actually look at is when you live in the world of blockchain, if you look at, let's say, top 20 cryptocurrency, right? What you're seeing is you see a group of currency which is like a proxy currency, like Bitcoin and things like that. But if you go down the list to about, I'll say 10 to 20, what you're seeing infrastructure blockchain, right? You see people like, oh, IOTA who want to do Internet of Things. When we say Go is trying to build our own kind of Visa network, and people's coming from projects like NIMS and NEO, they are building infrastructure. So what it means is actually they're global from day one, right? There's no, for example, for Omisego, our source code is open source, meaning that it's free. Anyone can pick it up now, anywhere in the world. We are global from day one. So there's no kind of like really clearly defined, because you're in the world of not centralized anymore. You're decentralized, right?
It's like a collaboration.
Yeah. So I think that regulation is one thing, but the way these things are being set and the way it's going to permeate is going to be really fast. As soon as the infrastructure guys are solving, scaling problems and costing problems, these things will just grow up. So the next question is, who will be the person who humanize the infrastructure? Who's going to build? We are every project right now. The top 20 are building the internet, but who's going to be the next Google? That's the question, right? Who's going to be the next Facebook? I think that's the important things to think about. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so first off, thank you for coming and taking the time. It's been a pleasure. I want to touch a bit about the HR aspect. So when you go out and you meet like people coming to pitch you and various projects, so what do you look for in a team? Is it pure tech? Does it need to be like programming? They need to know these different kind of languages. And people coming from myself, I work in e-commerce, so I'm very fond of blockchain and cryptocurrencies. I've been following it for a couple of years. But let's say that people like me want to make a move into blockchain-related companies and this whole sector. Do you have any advice? What kind of knowledge we should gain, or maybe you can elaborate a bit more on the HR aspect of it?
So I think when we are dealing with our enterprises, and I think what's interesting just for me personally is, like, the word I'm using is humanizing. So this is not just about deep tech, right? You have to have people putting UX UI design. How are you going to use this blockchain thing? People don't want to understand like how the internet works, but people want to see the end product. One more thing is that when you're talking about, so blockchain can, we can tokenize stuff. So you're also looking into tokenized economy, right? So just to give you an example, let's say a blockchain, it could be any blockchain projects. So let's say you have an asset like a house, like people mentioned, and you tokenize this as a form of a house. You put it on a decentralized exchange. There's an exchange. What happened when it's on on open market? What happened to that price, the representative of the house? So there's an economy to this as well. So one project that we are working at Omisego is, let's say, if you try to tokenize digital royalty points, how would that look like? Royalty is not an asset; it's a liability class. Every time enterprise mint, I would say, issue you royalties, they actually have to go back and book their own liability because it's a commitment to what would happen if, let's say, you're able to trade your air miles to Fiat, air miles to McDonald's point. How would that look? So there's also an economy part into this, a microeconomic part, a macroeconomic class. There's a mathematician, there's a designer that had to build around this. So I think it encompass all the field, I guess, from right now. It's very interesting to have that kind of input in the team if you're going to build something like that. Yeah, it's not just the deep tech. The deep techs let people like Vitalik and the gangs go and figure it out. But I think the important one is how to translate this into a proper use case and what you needed for that.
For myself, I think the necessary for the HR is the people should have like understand the concept, just the concept. They don't have to be like tech people, but they have to understand the concept of the blockchain and have the business idea. Just that for me.
Obviously, if you're developing blockchain, you probably need blockchain developers. But remember, at the end of the day, that you know, uh, if you're just building a tech company for the sake of tech, I guarantee you're not going to get anywhere. Um, it's got to solve a problem. So, again, this is an interesting movie because people are just talking about how amazing Bitcoin is, and it's going up in value, and it's going to change the world. But at the end of the day, um, other than as a speculative instrument, what has blockchain or what has Bitcoin actually done? People still can't really use it as a currency. It's incredibly difficult to basically pay for stuff with Bitcoin. You can move it around in the cloud, but it's very hard for me to go to Central and buy something with Bitcoin. Still very challenging to find ATMs where I can take out the currency in Bitcoin. So the price has been phenomenal, but in terms of mass adoption and use case, it isn't there yet. And every time I talk to people about Bitcoin, they're saying it's going to disrupt that, and it's going to change the world, and it's going to do that. Well, Bitcoin's actually been around since 2009. So 9 years later, we're still not there. And if they sit there and say it's going to take time, fine. I deal with technology with long development cycles. But when's it going to arrive? So when I get business plans where people say, I'm a blockchain company, and I'm like, well, great, but what are you trying to do? What problem are you trying to solve? And once they explain, like, we're trying to do this, this, and this, then I sit there and say, well, what specifically do you need blockchain for? If you're trying to solve a particular problem, they have to be able to explain to me that this is a problem that I can't create the solution unless blockchain enables it. Because there are actually a lot of blockchain companies that probably don't need blockchain. But if you do blockchain, you will get a valuation bump because there are VCs that are crazy about blockchain. But I sit there and say, I'm not going to give you a premium just because you put blockchain. Because I've talked to companies that said, we are a blockchain AI enabled, blah, blah, blah. And they'll throw every buzzword at me. And then I'll sit there and say, I still don't understand what you do. And so, you have to be able to sell the solution. I mean, I am dealing with companies. I have companies in my portfolio, fantastic people, very smart people, incredible technology, and they're hitting a brick wall because they're having trouble selling into banks. because they have the most phenomenal technology in the world and they can't articulate why it's valuable for the CTO to say, "Yep, here's $1 million, solve this problem for me." So start with, and this is true of any startup. You have to have that value proposition. What problem are you trying to solve? What value are you adding? And blockchain, AI, name your technology of the month. You have to be able to articulate why that enables that. And so, again, you want to have solid tech, but you have to know what the end use case of that tech is. Because I don't invest in blockchain. I invest in solutions for the bank, and some of those solutions run on blockchain. But I don't invest in it for the sake of investing in blockchain companies.
It's true. I mean, some of the use case, as you go around, you'll actually find that a centralized solution is actually better than the blockchain solution.
But it's funny that you mentioned about tokenized economy. If you sit there and say we're going to tokenize loyalty points so we can easily transfer loyalty points, you could see the value. So it's like if I have a bunch of Royal Orchid Plus Air Miles and I can easily transfer them or trade them on an exchange, I get that. But when people in the blockchain space and the token space say, "Oh, theoretically, you can tokenize a restaurant table and you can allocate portions of the income from that," I'm like, who cares about that? That is the most bullshit problem and solution I've ever heard. Oh, you can token I got a pitch on someone that wanted to tokenize, bodyguard services. And I'm like, okay, explain to me how that works and why anyone would care. And why is that going to be, that doesn't even have to be $1 billion idea. How's that even going to be a $10 million idea? So, there are a lot of cases where blockchain, you say it, it's like, wow, I get it, that makes sense. And then you kind of move off on this crazy direction. I'm like, okay, I don't know if I'm stupid or you're stupid, but one of us is stupid. And that's not a good combination to do an investment.
More questions, I guess? Any?
Hello, thanks for the information. Really, really helpful. You mentioned, Paul, that what is the use of Bitcoin, but how much of that is being stifled by government as they're intimidated, just like traditional taxis by Grab or Thailand banning Airbnb because they just don't understand it. It's a threat to traditional institutions. That if these guys are out of the way, just like Eric Verhey's said in the film, that we can have a functioning marketplace like Silk Road, regardless of what they're selling, that's functional. We don't need the banks. They're slow, they cause a lot of fees. So how much is institutions slowing the development of Bitcoin down? And
Okay, so
yeah,
no. So great question. So let's look at where some of the markets where digital payments that bypassed banks had the best opportunities. If you look at sort of the great granddaddy of digital payment applications, look at, say, M-Pesa in Kenya. The regulations are a mess. The banking industry is highly fractured. That is a market where people were basically trading currencies. There were so for those that aren't familiar, M-Pesa started out as an app that ran on feature phones. So smartphone penetration in Kenya is still fairly low. But if you rewind, I think maybe back to about 2008, 2010, I can't remember the origin. It might be earlier than that. So about 8-9 years ago, Safaricom, the telco, launched an application that ran off of text messaging that said you can go to any they had a network of cash in, cash out locations. It's mostly just wet markets and gas stations and just the corner butcher shop, and you could basically top up your M-Pesa account if you had Safaricom and say, here's 2,000 Kenyan shillings, and then you can text message your uncle back in some village in the rural area, and they would get the text message, and you just sent them 10,000 shillings or 2,000 shillings, and they can go to any local gas station, blah blah blah, whatever, and get money out. And that was bypassing the banks completely. That was probably one of the first markets where you started to see Bitcoin related payments. So BitPesa, which is one of the startups that started probably 2012, 2011, 2012, they've been sort of pioneering Bitcoin payments in Kenya. Um, you know, it's those are two different things. Being able to cash in and just send, currency via text message without converting into Bitcoin is one thing. Trading and making payments in Bitcoin, it's also a different form of digital currency, but it's a different thing. It's growing. Has it dominated the market? Has it completely displaced fiat currency? No, not yet. Um, would Bitcoin take off if it weren't so tightly regulated? Yeah, probably. But are ebooks going to completely displace paper books? You're always going to get people that I need a little bit of currency. I need to feel it. I need to touch it. There's. I'm going to say that there's always a role for some fiat. There's also a role for digital payments, but I'll say that even and again, China's a great example. China is probably one of the most cashless places on earth now, but it doesn't operate off of Bitcoin. So do you need Bitcoin to facilitate, electronic payments? Bitcoin in and of itself is just a vehicle. You know, so again, it's the idea of sending payments electronically, not having physical currency, not having to go through banks is a great thing. But is it necessarily Bitcoin itself as the vehicle? Because people are still sending renminbi. They're just not cashing out.
I think the problem comes with international transfers,
I mean,
right? If you have like different currencies and different tax regulations and different tax events. So right now there's a tax event every time you make an exchange. Well, it's obviously impossible to make a purchase if you have to get taxed 15% every time you do it. When you're talking about multiple countries, multiple scale, multi-regulations, we don't need that. We can have one that applies everywhere. Now, whether there's one or two, I don't know.
Currency, something like that.
Sorry?
You mean like one currency after
Or a small amount where the
Bitcoin
same
is
amount,
not
the
seen.
same regulations apply regardless of where you send it. It's like email. You don't have to go through customs or immigration or get a call from your bank when you send an email, but you do with money. It's just because of the different regulations that different countries have.
But and that's a great point. But at the end of the day, that's not a technology issue.
correct,
Whether that's digital or fiat, you're going to get taxed.
correct.
That's a human issue. That's a regulation issue. That's tax authorities wanting their cut. If you basically eliminate all that, you could just, whether it's fiat, whether it's digital. Obviously, digital means that you don't have to transport. There's no holding costs. Blah blah blah.
Well, that's a decentralized component of Bitcoin. So if you remove the people, you don't have these problems.
Yeah.
No, actually, I mean, in terms of like Bitcoins, it's not just about the regulation. I would say, like Bitcoin by itself is almost 10 years old already. It's actually pretty old, like blockchain 1.0, right? As you know, 5 years ago, the cost to transfer Bitcoins is like so little, but right now it's really expensive to send it across. And if you're looking at in terms of like transaction per second to build a block on the blockchain, like blockchain, I think you can do. I know Ethereum 15,
7 per second,
7 per second.
but compared to like Visa or Master, it's like 20,000 per second.
Yeah. So
Well, I think that's an interesting point because
Yeah.
I believe in the idea of cryptocurrency, but it doesn't necessarily have to be Bitcoin. Bitcoin is cryptocurrency 1.0. I think Facebook is a very powerful platform, but what was the social network before that? It was MySpace.
Yeah.
What was the great granddaddy of social networks? It was like 6 Degrees. I don't know if anyone's old enough to remember that. I do. Again, what are the most powerful social messaging platforms? It might be, it might be WhatsApp. It might be WeChat. What was the very first one? ICQ. Did anyone here use ICQ? It's lost in the annals of time. They got acquired by AOL and they screwed it all up. But again, it's funny that people cling to Bitcoin. It's like, oh, because it's the first, so it's the best. In every other technology, the first is not the best. The first is the worst it will ever be, and it gets better with every successive currency. So again, we have Ethereum now, but there are people that are working on better, faster, scalable cryptocurrencies. So I think the most powerful cryptocurrency 10 years from now probably hasn't been invented yet. So the whole idea, so again, it's one thing to separate out Bitcoin from blockchain, but it's important to separate out Bitcoin from every other cryptocurrency out there. The idea of cryptocurrencies is amazing, but I don't know why Bitcoin purists cling to Bitcoin itself. Because again, it's like you said, you're talking, several transactions, only a handful of transactions per second. We're talking about 300 megawatt hours per transaction. I think right now they're saying, I think those that are studying the energy consumption are saying, I think end of last year it was 2.6 gigawatts of power that's being consumed by the Bitcoin blockchain. That's the amount of power that the Republic of Ireland consumes in a year, and that number is going to triple by the end of this year. So Bitcoin, great, it led the way, but my eye is what's on the next cryptocurrency.
I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist, but on that last point, with respect to proof of work and security, the problem is it works. So proof of staking is still pretty dodgy as far as securing your money to it. Like if you look at EOS with only 21 nodes, 21 people controlling the flow of that money, versus probably the most decentralized coin or project in Bitcoin. Even Ethereum you can look at, there's Vitalik it's more centralized than Bitcoin. So there seems to be this trade-off between speed and security, and right now it seems like proof of work is the only one that seems to prove the most secure.
Sure,
despite its
but
problems with
that's the
green
thing
energy
is
and such.
the thing with technology is that you don't choose between one versus the other. You basically find someone that's going to create the next one that says, let's actually have both. So proof of work, proof of stake versus scalability. Vitalik's talking about sharding. They're talking about plasma. It's like, again, someone's going to come along and take elements of all of these and create the next mega cryptocurrency. And then someone's going to poke holes in that, and someone's going to come up with the next one. So, is Facebook the social media network to dominate them all? Probably not, because I'm imagining that China's going to come along and create something new and disrupt that, and then 10 years from now, there's going to be someone that disrupt that. So for me, I go back. It's like, again, in theory, the architecture of Bitcoin is insanely elegant, but in practicality, it doesn't scale. The power consumption is huge. Now, someone may come along and figure out how to solve that. And to be honest, maybe the cost of solar will come down fast enough to keep up with that. But right now, the energy consumption of blockchain or Bitcoin is outpacing the price drops in solar. So which one wins? Who knows? But in the meantime, bet on, I think they say 2,000 cryptocurrencies. Maybe cryptocurrency 2001 becomes the next big one. Maybe cryptocurrency number, 1,000, 10,000, whatever. But, again, it's technology. So the new technology is always going to trump the old ones.
I think Paul is right. Like if you remember back in terms of like the film that we watch, Bitcoins actually comes after a whole bunch of projects, right? So I would think that the next generation of what we'll be building is going to be built on top of this whole thing, like proof of work, the pro and con of proof of work, proof of stakes, proof of authority, and so many proof right now, and a lot of like scaling solution. There's layer 1 and layer 2. So this is the time where the infrastructure is still being built, I guess. So, and I will also think that the next one will be come of a combination, or there might not just be one. There might be multiple for multiple use case, right? So that could also happen. Yeah. Some use case might say, I don't need 100% consensus. Some will say proof of authority is fine. Some will say, no, I need 100% consensus. So,
And the thing to keep in mind is that you don't need one blockchain to rule them all. You can have different blockchains for different uses. They don't all need to be 6-lane highways. Some parts of the city you have a 6-lane highway. Some parts of the city, you have like, a 1-lane soy. You have different routes for different needs. And then it's just a matter of interconnecting them all.
Layer 2 and layer 1, even Visa, you don't get immediate confirmations on your transactions up to a week, because they'll do like layer 2 quick transactions and then dump it to a layer 1, which maybe take a week, like which what maybe Bitcoin will serve. It'll be a backbone to the framework underneath as a layer 1 service, and then on layer 2, whether it's going to be Lightning or something else. Um,
And this hasn't escaped either Visa or MasterCard's notice. They know that the idea of credit cards, it's like credit cards were invented in the 1950s with Diners Club. They realize that they're operating a technology that's essential, like the technology stack on it, but the whole concept of credit cards. Like, why do you need a card, a piece of plastic that has a number on it? The idea of, at the end of the day, I think they're starting to realize that their purpose is to basically enable payments. The card is just the vehicle. So actually, both of those companies have venture arms. You have Visa Ventures, and MasterCard has their own corporate venture arm. These guys are looking at payment technologies. They're looking at blockchain. They're looking at cryptocurrency. They know that the writing is on the wall. So, it's like I think the banks understand this as well. We as a bank, we are glacial. We are dinosaurs, but we're dinosaurs that can see the meteor coming, and we're at least engaging with technologies. There's a reason why SCB put together $100 million fund, and it's not to invest in, it's not to experiment with little bits of technology. It's to go out in the world and figure out what are the technologies that are completely going to disrupt our financial services. We don't know what a bank's going to look like 10 years from now.
Yeah.
We just want to know that whatever it looks like, we're part of that.
Yeah, I think that point is also very important as we focus more in terms of like today we're discussing blockchain, right? But there's also a lot of other technologies around that people are actually are kind of like sometimes overlook. So things like AI, big data, how is this combination with blockchain will look like. Um, Things that I really like it, and people maybe can add is if someone from Europe, PSD2, open API from the banks. This is something really powerful. I and imagine that open API for banking as a service, and blockchain.
Don't hold your breath.
My
The banks
God.
don't have the platform for it. It's going to take a long. Even the European banks aren't completely ready for PSD2. It's going to be a while before you see true API-based open banking. All the banks are looking at it, but it's going to take a little bit longer than any of us would like.
More questions in terms of blockchain and stuff. Yeah.
Sorry, can
Yeah,
I ask another
sure.
one?
Yeah, sure.
Paul, investors in blockchain and crypto, everybody's talking about the institutional money. When's the institutional money going to come in? You're close to the banks. What are they? How long realistically do you think before they'll come in with any kind of seriousness? What are they waiting for to happen? What are they saying as far as the barriers to entry?
Institutional money into what? Into
Into
blockchain or into
in-
crypto?
investing into crypto projects.
Maybe not, a lot of VC money has already started pouring into ICOs.
Like ETFs and stuff.
I think a lot of it is, I don't think Thai corporates or even Thai financial institutions are averse to anything crypto related. I mean, we see it as another asset class. It's just a matter of when will the regulators allow regulated banks to engage in crypto. Thailand only just got their VC law 2 years ago, and as a regulated bank, I am not permitted to hold crypto. As a bank, we're not allowed to hold crypto. We're not allowed to operate a crypto exchange. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't be interested in doing it. I think the thing is that people forget, like, oh, banks ask for all this information and they're just really, so this is not us. This is the regulator saying you need to do all these checks. You need to do all these balances. You need to have all these safety protocols. To be honest, if we can get rid of our entire compliance department, we'd do it tomorrow. We'd engage in crypto. It's like we're seeing the money that's being made. If anything, who's in the best position to hedge a lot of those risks? Banks. We've got armies of analysts and PhDs, and we could hedge whatever. We will do everything that the regulator allows us to do. But are other corporates looking at crypto, or are they looking at blockchain? Hell yeah. like I said, I can't hold XRP, but I can hold Ripple. And if I want to invest in other blockchain companies, we will. The minute they say, you can now hold tokens, we'll look at some of these big blockchain. We'll look at, we'll look at crypto. We'll look at crypto funds. And it's actually now moved into the mainstream. Andreessen Horowitz just announced a $300 million crypto fund. That's news that just came out earlier today. And then you already have these large existing funds, Fenbushi Capital, Pantera, these are big funds. Sequoia has already started looking, I think they were investing in Binance and then they had the legal problems. The big VC funds are looking at crypto and the big corporates invest in the big VC funds.
I think we are running out of time. Can I have the last questions from the audience? Any further questions? Sure.
Yes. I have friends who are real strong supporters of Bitcoin, but I have my apprehensions actually. From the short flip that we saw just earlier, until today, I think nobody really knows who came up with Bitcoin. We just have a Japanese sounding name, but yeah, but who is he? I mean, I think we cannot just create something, some of value out from the sky, Okay, we have mining of bitcoins, which you mentioned that they use a lot of electricity, but they earn it through solving some algorithms. But what benefit do we get out of it?
What is the value of a Google share? And what is that backed by? What is the value of a US dollar? The value of those things are what people are willing to pay for it. I get it. So I understand. There's a difference between, value and utility. But the thing is, it's undeniable that Bitcoin has a value because people are willing to pay for it. Is there utility? Can you take it out? Can you pay for things? That's a different question. But it doesn't really matter who is Satoshi Nakamoto. It doesn't matter. And this is the same thing that I told our chairman when he asked, does it really matter? Bitcoin has right now, as of a couple of hours ago, had a $105 billion market capitalization. So it's hard to sit there and say it's this imaginary thing that doesn't have value. It has value to people that are willing to bid it up to 105 billion. We sit there and say, well, it's not backed by the full faith and credit of a government like a fiat currency is. But it is backed by the full faith and credit of traders that are willing to bid up and support the price.
Yeah, if you look at it as a form of commodity, perhaps, since it has got a limited number of issuance.
I mean, one thing I think Bitcoin can be compared to, for me personally, is when you look at gold, right? Gold is just a finite supply, I would say. It's like there's a certain amount of gold in the world. And in older time, when you use as a proxy of exchange, it's people who recognize gold. It could be anything, actually, right? So it's this belief, it's this trust that this actually worth something. So Bitcoin is almost like an equivalent of that. A consensus of people say, this actually agreed that it has values. For fiat currency, is of course being backed by the central government, right? But you go back all the way to the gold standard, where in older times when there was a gold standard that you need a certain amount of gold reserve to actually mint a currency, it's the same thing, I would say. Like the new generation of tokenization, you can have a stable coins. That's what Bank of Thailand is working on. So it could be the next generation. But all in all, it's about consensus. It's about trust. It's about people perception of what is actually worth. It could be, a piece of stone. It could be platinum. It could be ruby. It could be diamonds or whatsoever.
It could be a seashell.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah. Correct.
Maori tribesmen in Polynesia used to trade seashells as currency. Again, I think the problem is when you start using the word currency, it confuses a lot of people because it's a question of will it replace fiat? But the question is, could it complement fiat? There's actually, I have a good friend that actually spoke at Davos a couple of months back, and she's a very big believer in cryptocurrency, and she said, Bitcoin is not meant to be a replacement for fiat, but it is an interesting replacement for gold. I think when the Greek economy was imploding about 2, 3 years back, the Greeks were pouring money into Bitcoin, not as a substitute for its currency, but in times when you have times of incredible economic dislocation in the past, people would pour money into gold as a safe harbor. And then, if they had to flee the country, they'd carry the gold out. Now people are using Bitcoin for that very same value. So are they doing it as a substitute for their fiat? No, they're using it as a safe harbor of value. So, and again, I'd have to think about it a little bit more, but I think, saying that there might be a substitute, crypto is a substitute for gold, substitute for a different commodity, that's certainly an argument worth spending some time thinking about.
So may I ask your panelists to, do you have any final thoughts or final thing for the audience today? What you think about the session? Any?
Not really.
I think it's an interesting space. A lot of things are changing every day. So if you're interested in this space, there's a lot of reading afternoons also do. And hopefully we have a little bit more of this kind of forum, because I think awareness is really important. One joke was I went to one of the Thailand biggest company for a blockchain meeting, and then a bunch of SVP walk in, and then the golden statement is this the Bitcoin talk? And it's not. It's actually not. It's like blockchain and Bitcoin is so different.
That wasn't my company, was it?
No.